The bright morning sun streamed through the airport's massive windows as Dr. Chen adjusted her navy blue blazer, double-checking the time on her watch. In just 6 hours, she was supposed to present groundbreaking research at the Harvard Medical Conference, research that could change how doctors treat brain tumors. Her presentation materials were safely tucked away in her leather briefcase, reviewed for the 100th time during her early morning coffee. This trip to Boston was like any other business flight she'd taken over the past decade as a leading neurosurgeon. The familiar airport routine, check-in, security, coffee, and then the peaceful walk to her gate. Today, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the extra strong coffee, or perhaps it was the unusual weight of responsibility her research carried. Standing at gate B17, she pulled out her phone to send a quick text to her team back at the hospital. That's when she noticed the gate agent staring at her. Not the casual glance airport staff usually give passengers, but an intense, suspicious look that made her stomach tighten slightly. "Ma'am, could you step aside, please?" The agent called out, waving her over with a stiff gesture. Dr. Chen looked up from her phone, noticing how the agent's eyes narrowed at her first-class boarding pass. Around her, other passengers began boarding the plane without any extra scrutiny, their tickets barely getting a glance. "Is there a problem?" Dr. Chen asked, maintaining her professional composure despite the growing knot in her stomach. She'd earned her frequent flyer status the hard way. Countless hours in the air, traveling between medical conferences and specialized surgeries. "Your boarding pass appears irregular," the agent said, emphasizing the last word while squinting at the perfectly standard ticket on her screen. The agent's voice carried just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, causing several heads to turn. A small crowd began to gather, some pretending to check their phones while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. Dr. Chen felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from a familiar frustration she'd faced too many times before. She'd spent years in operating rooms making life and death decisions, earned multiple degrees with honors, and saved countless lives. Yet here she stood, being questioned about a boarding pass as if she'd somehow snuck into the first-class line. "I'm a Platinum Elite member," she explained calmly, pulling up her airline app to show her status. "I fly this route at least twice a month for medical conferences and surgeries." Her words were measured, practiced from years of staying professional in tense situations. The gate agent's response was to wave over a colleague and a security officer, their approaching footsteps drawing even more attention to the scene. Dr. Chen noticed a young woman in the crowd discreetly holding up her phone, the red recording light blinking silently. What was supposed to be a routine morning was quickly becoming something else entirely. But Dr. Chen stood tall, her hand steady on her briefcase handle, years of performing complex surgeries under pressure having taught her how to keep cool when all eyes were on her. She knew the next few moments would matter, not just for her flight, but for something much bigger than a simple boarding pass verification. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal seemed to grow harsher as a second gate agent hurried over, security badge swinging with each step. Dr. Chen watched as they huddled together, whispering and pointing at her boarding pass on the computer screen. The growing knot in her stomach tightened. Her presentation at Harvard was in 6 hours, and every minute spent here put her further at risk of missing it. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see additional identification," the new agent announced, her voice carrying an edge of authority that made nearby passengers pause their conversations. Dr. Chen reached into her bag, producing not only her driver's license, but also her hospital ID badge, complete with her credentials as chief of neurosurgery. "I have all my documentation right here," she said, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. "As I mentioned, I'm a Platinum Elite member. I've flown over 100,000 miles with your airline in the past year alone." The security officer, a tall man with graying temples, stepped closer, his walkie-talkie crackling with static. Around them, other passengers continued boarding, their tickets receiving nothing more than a cursory glance. A businessman in a rumpled suit walked past. His boarding pass barely looked at before he was waved through with a smile. The contrast wasn't lost on the growing audience. Several passengers had slowed their walk to witness the scene, and Dr. Chen noticed more phones being held at careful angles, their cameras capturing the moment. One woman, wearing a bright red blazer, had stopped completely, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. Protocol requires us to thoroughly verify any suspicious documentation, the first agent stated, emphasizing the word suspicious in a way that made Dr. Chen's professional demeanor crack slightly. She performed brain surgery just 3 days ago, held patients' lives in her hands, and yet here she stood, being treated like an imposter. Could you explain what exactly appears suspicious about my boarding pass? Dr. Chen asked, her voice taking on the same calm but firm tone she used when teaching medical residents. I'd like to understand the specific concerns. The agents exchanged uncomfortable glances. The security officer shifted his weight from one foot to another, his hand resting unnecessarily on his radio. The silence that followed her question spoke volumes. A delayed flight announcement echoed through the terminal, but few in the growing crowd seemed to notice. The woman in the red blazer had moved closer, her phone now openly recording the interaction. Other passengers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others looking away uncomfortably. Dr. Chen thought about all the times she'd stayed quiet in similar situations. At high-end restaurants, in luxury stores, even at medical conferences, where people assumed she was part of the support staff rather than a keynote speaker. But today felt different. Maybe it was the urgency of her presentation, or perhaps it was just the right moment to take a stand. She pulled out her phone and opened her airline app again, this time pulling up her travel history. I'd like to speak with a supervisor, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. And I'd like documentation of why my valid boarding pass is being questioned when others are passing through without similar scrutiny. The first agent's face flushed red. The second one reached for a phone at the desk, likely calling for backup. But Dr. Chen stood her ground, her posture straight, her expression composed. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her that sometimes the most powerful response was calm persistence. The young doctor who'd once been told she didn't look like a surgeon was now a respected professional who wouldn't let bias, subtle or blatant, go unchallenged. As more passengers gathered and more phones recorded, what started as a simple boarding pass verification was quickly becoming something much more significant. A moment that would soon travel far beyond Gate B-17. Time seemed to slow down in the crowded terminal as Dr. Chen waited for the supervisor. The clicking of rolling suitcases and distant flight announcements faded into background noise. She thought about her patients back at the hospital, about the young resident she'd mentored who told her, "You taught me that standing up for what's right is just as important as surgical precision." The supervisor finally arrived, a woman with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes that suggested she'd seen her fair share of airport dramas. But this wasn't going to be just another incident report to file away. "I understand there's a concern about my boarding pass," Dr. Chen began, her voice carrying the same steady confidence she used when explaining complex procedures to worried families. "I'd like to address this situation directly, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been in a similar position." She pulled out her phone again, this time opening her email folder. "Here are my Harvard Medical Conference credentials, where I'm presenting in." She checked her watch. 5 hours and 20 minutes. "Here's my hospital surgical schedule showing my flight patterns. And here's my airline status history." The crowd had grown larger, with some passengers from neighboring gates drifting over. The woman in the red blazer was still recording, joined now by others who sensed they were witnessing something important. Even a few airline staff from nearby gates had paused their duties to watch. "What concerns me isn't just the questioning of my boarding pass," Dr. Chen continued, her words measured and clear. "It's the pattern I've observed while standing here. I've watched 12 passengers board while we've had this discussion. None of their boarding passes received this level of scrutiny. The supervisor's expression shifted as she processed these words. Around them, several onlookers nodded in recognition. An elderly gentleman in the crowd spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. I saw the same thing. Been sitting here for an hour waiting for my connection. Dr. Chen felt a sudden wave of emotion, not anger, but a deep determination. This moment wasn't just about catching a flight anymore. It was about all the times she'd stayed quiet, all the times others had stayed quiet. I'm not interested in causing a scene, she said, her professional demeanor unwavering. I'm interested in accountability and change. Every minute I stand here is a minute taken away from preparing for a presentation that could help advance brain cancer treatment. But sometimes we have to pause our own journeys to make the path easier for those who'll come after us. The supervisor pulled out her tablet, fingers moving quickly across the screen. The original gate agents shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence deflating with each passing moment. The security officer had stepped back, his hand no longer resting on his radio. A younger airport employee who had been watching the scene approached the supervisor, speaking in low tones. From the fragments of conversation that carried across the gate area, words like policy review and immediate action floated through the air. The terminal's usual buzz of activity had changed around Gate B-17. Strangers who normally would have been absorbed in their phones or laptops were engaged, connected by the shared recognition of a moment that mattered. An older woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Two business travelers exchanged knowing looks. Dr. Chen stood tall, her leather briefcase still gripped firmly in her hand. In the operating room, she'd learned that the most critical moments often required both patience and decisiveness. This wasn't so different, taking a stand while maintaining the composure that had carried her through countless surgeries and challenges. The growing crowd, the recording phones, the whispered conversations, they all pointed to something bigger than a simple boarding pass verification. Sometimes change happened in grand gestures, but more often it happened in moments like these. When someone decided to stand their ground with dignity, when bystanders chose to bear witness, when truth spoke quietly but firmly to power. The supervisor's eyes widened as she scrolled through her tablet, her fingers suddenly freezing mid-swipe. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The kind of look someone gets when they realize they've made a massive mistake. The terminal's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she looked up from the screen, then back down again, as if hoping the information might somehow change. Dr. Chen, she began, her voice notably different from the bureaucratic tone she'd arrived with. I see you've flown with us. 137 times in the past year alone. The supervisor turned to the gate agents, whose faces had begun to pale. She's one of our highest-tier frequent flyers. The crowd that had gathered around Gate B-17 grew perfectly still. The only sounds were the distant announcements echoing through the terminal and the soft whir of phones still recording the scene. The woman in the red blazer stepped closer, making sure to capture every word. Not just a frequent flyer, the supervisor continued, scrolling further. You're actually featured in our Airlines magazine from last month. The article about medical professionals making breakthroughs in, she squinted at the screen, neurosurgical techniques for pediatric patients. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The security officer, who had been standing firmly beside the gate agents, took a small step back. His walkie-talkie remained silent at his hip. Dr. Chen adjusted her glasses, maintaining her professional composure, even as relief tried to creep into her expression. Yes, that article was about our team's work with children who have rare brain conditions. Work that I'm supposed to be presenting at Harvard in. She checked her watch again. Just under 5 hours now. The young airport employee who had earlier whispered to the supervisor now stood at the computer terminal, pointing at something on the screen. Her boarding pass was automatically flagged for an upgrade due to her status, she explained, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The system was trying to move her to first class, not marking it as suspicious. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. The very thing that had caused her to be questioned, her premium boarding pass, was actually an automatic reward for her loyalty to the airline. The elderly gentleman who had spoken up earlier let out a low whistle. "I believe we owe you a significant apology, Dr. Chen," the supervisor said, her professional mask cracking to show genuine remorse. "And more than that, we owe you an explanation." She turned to the original gate agents, who now seemed intensely interested in their shoes. This should never have escalated to this point. The woman in the red blazer finally lowered her phone, but not before capturing the supervisor's words. Other passengers who had been recording did the same, many of them already tapping at their screens, no doubt sharing what they'd witnessed. The younger airport employee stepped forward with a new boarding pass in hand. "We've confirmed your upgrade to first class, Dr. Chen. And I've already called ahead to have someone meet you at the gate in Boston to ensure you make your connection to the conference." But Dr. Chen didn't immediately reach for the boarding pass. Instead, she looked around at the faces in the crowd, the business people who had paused their rushed journeys, the families who had stopped to watch, the airline staff from other gates who had drifted over. Each one was a witness to something that happened too often, but was rarely documented so clearly. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gate area. "But I hope this moment becomes more than just an apology and an upgrade. I hope it becomes a reason for change." She reached for her briefcase, which still held the presentation that could help change lives, if she made it to Harvard in time. Sometimes the most important journeys aren't the ones that take us from one city to another, but from one way of thinking to another. By the time Dr. Chen's flight landed in Boston, the video of her experience had already spread across social media like wildfire. The woman in the red blazer, a popular content creator with a focus on social justice, had shared the footage on multiple platforms. Her caption read, "Watch how this accomplished doctor handles discrimination with incredible grace and professionalism. This happened 20 Airline at Gate B17. Comments flooded in by the thousands. Many shared their own similar experiences at airports, while others expressed outrage at the clear double standard they'd witnessed in the video. "Watch how other passengers walk right through while they grilled her about everything," one comment noted. "The difference in treatment is right there on camera." The airline's social media team scrambled to respond as the video hit 1 million views within hours. Their first statement felt corporate and hollow. "We take all customer concerns seriously and are investigating this incident." The public wasn't having it. The responses came swift and sharp. "We can see what happened. It's all on video. Do better." News outlets picked up the story by early afternoon. Renowned neurosurgeon questioned over suspicious first-class boarding pass, read one headline. Another declared, "Medical pioneer faces profiling at airport, airline under fire." Dr. Chen's hospital issued a statement of support, highlighting her decade of groundbreaking work and countless lives saved. In the quiet of her hotel room that evening, after successfully delivering her presentation at Harvard, Dr. Chen scrolled through the notifications flooding her phone. Professional colleagues, former patients, and strangers alike were reaching out. A message from one of her residents caught her eye. "You showed us how to stand up for what's right without losing your dignity. Thank you for being our teacher in more ways than one." The woman in the red blazer had posted a follow-up video, revealing more details from that morning. What the first video didn't show, she explained, was how other passengers started speaking up too. This elderly man called it exactly what it was. A gate agent from another airline came over and looked absolutely horrified. People weren't just watching, they were witnessing. Industry forums and travel blogs began analyzing the incident from every angle. A pilot's discussion board lit up with airline employees sharing their own observations of systemic issues. "We see this happen too often," wrote one flight attendant. It's time for real change, not just sensitivity training videos. A travel writers group compiled statistics about similar incidents, placing Dr. Chen's experience in a broader context. Their research showed a disturbing pattern that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. The numbers told a story that needed to be heard. Local community organizations began reaching out to the airline, requesting meetings to discuss policy changes. A civil rights group offered support, but Dr. Chen had her own approach in mind. She didn't want lawsuits or settlements. She wanted transformation. That night, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with one last notification. The video had reached 5 million views. But it wasn't the numbers that caught her attention. It was the comments from young people, particularly young girls of color, saying things like, "Watch how calm and professional she stays. That's power. And this is how you stand up for yourself. Taking notes for my future." Dr. Chen thought about her morning surgery scheduled 2 days later, about the lives she'd worked to save once she returned home. The incident at Gate B17 hadn't just exposed a problem. It had opened a door for change. As she finally drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of all the future doctors, lawyers, and professionals who might face similar moments. Perhaps now, because of one recorded incident at an airport gate, their journeys might be a little easier. 3 days after the incident, the airline's response landed in Dr. Chen's email inbox with a familiar corporate tone. Free miles, flight vouchers, and a carefully worded apology that felt more like a legal document than a genuine acknowledgement. She read it during a quick break between surgeries, the operating room's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as she removed her surgical cap. "We deeply regret any inconvenience," the email began. Her medical resident noticed her slight head shake as she read. "Is everything okay, Dr. Chen?" they asked, concern evident in their voice. "Sometimes," she replied, setting down her phone, "the biggest opportunities for change come disguised as corporate apologies." She had already started drafting her response in her mind, drawing on 20 years of breaking down complex problems into solvable pieces, the same way she approached difficult surgeries. That evening, after completing her rounds, Dr. Chen sat in her office overlooking the city lights. Instead of accepting the vouchers or launching a lawsuit, she began typing a different kind of letter. Her words weren't angry or accusatory. They were purposeful, like a surgeon's careful incisions. "Dear Board of Directors," she began, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. "I'm writing not to demand compensation, but to offer a solution." She outlined specific points where airport procedures could be improved, drawing from her own experience managing large medical teams and implementing systematic changes. The letter took shape, point by point. "Your staff needs more than just basic diversity training. They need real-world scenarios, practical tools for checking their biases, and clear protocols that protect both passengers and employees. I've developed similar programs for hospital staff, and I've seen how effective they can be when done right." She included statistics from recent studies on transportation equity, carefully compiled by her research team. Numbers that couldn't be ignored, patterns that needed to be addressed. But she also added personal touches, stories from other medical professionals who had reached out to share similar experiences. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications. The video had now reached international audiences, sparking discussions in multiple languages. But Dr. Chen stayed focused on her letter, knowing that real change needed more than viral moments. "While free miles and vouchers might satisfy some passengers," she wrote, "they don't address the root cause. Your airline has an opportunity to lead by example, to set new industry standards that others will have to follow." A knock on her office door interrupted her typing. One of her long-term patients, an elderly grandmother, had stopped by for a follow-up visit. "I saw what happened to you at the airport," she said softly. "You handled it just like you handled my surgery, with grace under pressure." That conversation gave Dr. Chen another idea. She added a section to her letter about customer experiences. about how treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, it was good business. She included concrete suggestions for staff training, policy updates, and accountability measures. As midnight approached, she read over her final draft. It wasn't just a complaint letter, it was a blueprint for change. She had included her credentials, her research experience, and her willingness to consult on implementing these changes. The letter was professional yet personal, firm yet constructive. Before hitting send, she added one final paragraph. This isn't about punishment or public shaming. It's about progress. Your airline can choose to see this incident as a PR problem to manage, or as an opportunity to become a leader in equitable customer service. I'm offering my expertise to help you choose the latter. She clicked send, knowing that sometimes the most powerful responses to discrimination aren't loud protests or legal threats, but calm, systematic plans for change. As she gathered her things to head home, she thought about all the future travelers who might benefit if even half of her suggestions were implemented. The call from the airline's CEO came exactly 1 week after Dr. Chen sent her letter. She was reviewing patient scans when her office phone lit up. At first, she thought it might be about an emergency surgery, but the voice on the other end belonged to someone who'd clearly spent the last week doing his homework. Dr. Chen, he began, his tone notably different from the corporate speak of previous communications. I've read your letter 3 times. I've also read every one of your published papers on implementing systematic change in medical institutions. We need to talk. She set down her pen, giving the conversation her full attention. The CEO continued, What struck me wasn't just your handling of the incident. It was your vision for how we could do better, really do better, not just say we will. The conversation that followed wasn't what anyone might have expected. Instead of damage control or legal negotiations, they discussed real solutions. The CEO shared his own awakening. I've been watching that video with different teams in our company. Every time I watch it, I notice something new we need to fix. He revealed that her letter had circulated among the board members, sparking intense discussions. One of our board members is a former patient of yours, he explained. She stood up in our emergency meeting and said, If Dr. Chen can remain that professional while performing brain surgery, we can certainly do better checking boarding passes. As they talked, Dr. Chen moved to her office window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The CEO laid out a proposal that went far beyond what she'd expected. They wanted her to help develop new training protocols, not just for their airline, but as an industry standard. We're creating a new diversity advisory board, he explained, and we'd like you to take a leading role. Your experience in implementing systematic changes in high-pressure environments is exactly what we need. Dr. Chen thought about all the times she faced similar situations, in medical school, in residency, in hospital boardrooms. Each time, she'd push for change from within, using her expertise and experience to build better systems. Here's what I propose, the CEO continued. We want to start with a complete review of our training procedures. But we don't want generic solutions. We want real, measurable changes that will make a difference. He shared how the video had affected employee morale. Our own staff have been coming forward with stories and suggestions. They want to be part of the solution. Your letter gave us a framework to make that happen. The conversation shifted to specific plans. They discussed creating simulation-based training programs, similar to what Dr. Chen had developed for surgical residents. If we can train people to handle high-stress medical situations, she suggested, we can certainly train them to handle passenger interactions with respect and professionalism. As they wrapped up the call, the CEO made one final point. Dr. Chen, what happened at that gate was unacceptable. But your response? Choosing to make it a moment for change rather than just conflict. That's exactly why we need your help. After hanging up, Dr. Chen sat quietly for a moment, thinking about how one difficult morning at an airport gate had opened up an unexpected path for change. Her phone buzzed with a text from the woman in the red blazer who'd recorded the original video. You won't believe how many people your story has inspired to speak up. Looking at her surgical schedule for the next day, Dr. Chen smiled slightly. Tomorrow, she would save lives in the operating room. But now she had another way to make a difference, helping to build systems that treated everyone with the dignity they deserved. Sometimes, she realized, the most important changes come not from tearing things down, but from being invited to help build them up better. 1 year later, Dr. Chen stood in the same airport, but everything felt different. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, just like it had that day, but now she wasn't heading to a medical conference. Today, she was delivering the keynote speech for the airline's new staff training program. Looking out at the audience filled with gate agents, flight attendants, and airport security personnel, she adjusted her microphone. A year ago, I stood at gate B17 just down this terminal, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the conference room. That morning could have ended with anger, with lawsuits, or with nothing changing at all. Instead, it became the beginning of something remarkable. The statistics displayed on the screen behind her told a powerful story. Reports of discriminatory incidents had dropped by 60% across the airline's routes. Customer satisfaction scores had risen dramatically. Other airlines had begun adopting their new training protocols. But numbers don't tell the whole story, she continued, clicking to a new slide. Real change happens in small moments, in daily interactions. She shared stories that had been sent to her over the past year, from passengers, from staff, from other professionals who had faced similar situations. A young gate agent raised her hand during a Q&A session. The new protocols you helped develop, she said, they don't just tell us what not to do. They help us understand why and how to do better. It's changed how I approach every passenger. Dr. Chen smiled, remembering how the training program had evolved. They'd moved beyond basic diversity seminars to create practical, scenario-based training. Staff learned to recognize their biases and had clear, professional protocols to follow. Most importantly, they understood the human impact of their actions. During the break, she walked down to Gate B17, now famous within the company as the place where change began. The woman in the red blazer was there too, invited to share her perspective on how social media can drive accountability. Her original video had become a teaching tool, shown in training sessions across the country. "Did you ever imagine this would happen?" the woman asked, gesturing at the conference room full of engaged airline staff. That one morning could lead to all this. Dr. Chen thought about the changes she'd seen. The airline had transformed its approach from the ground up. New hiring practices, clear accountability measures, and most importantly, a culture that valued dignity and professionalism above all else. Other companies had taken notice, reaching out for guidance on implementing similar changes. Back in the conference room, she shared one final story. "Last week, I received an email from a young medical student. She told me she'd been nervous about traveling to her residency interviews, worried about facing discrimination. But then she flew with this airline, and something remarkable happened. Nothing. She was treated with the same respect as every other passenger. No drama, no viral videos, just professional service. That's what real change looks like." The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Staff members role-played challenging situations, applying the new protocols they'd learned. Dr. Chen watched as they handled each scenario with growing confidence and professionalism. As the day wound down, a veteran flight attendant approached her. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I've been flying for 25 years. This past year has been different. We're not just avoiding problems, we're actually doing our jobs better." Standing at the airport window, watching planes take off into the evening sky, Dr. Chen reflected on how far they'd come. The incident that could have been just another viral video had instead sparked genuine transformation. She thought about all the passengers who would never know why their experience was different now, why they could simply focus on their travels without worry or fear. Her phone buzzed with a text. The hospital needed her for an emergency surgery. As she gathered her things to leave, she smiled at the symmetry. A year ago, she'd been rushing to save lives in one way. Today, she was helping save something else: dignity, respect, and the hope that change was possible when people chose to build it together.